Hello, Becket.
Hi. Hey, Peter. How are you?
Good. How are you?
Good. Thank you for inviting me to do this.
Thank you for coming or joining.
Mhm.
Mandarin?
Yes, please. Don't mind if I do. Wonderful.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining the first online library talk we are organizing. My name is Peter. I work at the library of the Rijksakademie Academy and the Sandberg Institute, which is currently closed until the end of April. We hope you're all doing well, seeing the circumstances. To my right is Becket. But before the start, I want to make a brief service announcement. From next Monday onwards, we'll be lending out books again at the library. The library will be closed, but you will be able to mail your requests to library@rijksakademie.nl, and we'll make it possible again to pick up books now that the period is extended until the end of April. But we will make more information public about that soon, and how to pick up your books there. Back to the talk. We're back. We're very happy that Becket MWN is with us today. For the last years, we've been hosting this series at the library, at some points more actively than on other times. And each time we've invited speakers that make a selection of books from the collection of the library, but also for also new titles for the library to acquire. And then during a talk, every speaker gives a talk about what these sources mean to their practice. So this time we've invited Becket to give a talk with the restrictions that all the sources have to be available online for everybody to consult after. And today's selection of sound, movies, texts, articles is available as well through a WeTransfer link that you can find through Commons if all works well. It's a package that you need to download, has a couple of PDFs and some links. And there's also, I'll show it here. There's also this overview of all the things that you will find there. And that will be part of the talk. So for now, during the talk, they will all be streamed. So it's all the sounds and all the things will come straight to your screen. So Becket MWN is an artist and a writer. He received his MFA from the University of Southern California in 2014 and attended the Rijksakademie residency program in 2016 and 17. He's working with sound, performance, sculpture, and text, and he has recently exhibited and performed at Bij Cosy, at Rongwrong, Amsterdam, SculptureCenter New York, Canal, Amsterdam, How to Show Up, Amsterdam, Saliva, Barcelona, Vleeshal, Middelburg, and other places. He has presented his writing as Becket Flannery for bologna.cc, Castrum Pelegrini, If I Can't Dance, I Don't Want to Be Part of Your Evolution, and Public Fiction, among others. His first book, The Chance Event, Wherein, is forthcoming from Athénée Press. And Becket teaches studio practice in the graduation year at the Rijksakademie at the Finance Department. He's also hosting a series called Goth Talk that you can find through Instagram. I think it's also Goth Talk, simply no underscore Becket.
At goth_talk.
Okay. I also want to take the occasion to thank Jim Clock for all the design he's been doing for this event. And yes, if you want to ask something, if you want to comment on something, you can do it. If all goes well, you can comment in the YouTube comments, and Becket can respond after the talk. If something doesn't go well, also please, if you couldn't hear anything, please comment there. Becket,
All right.
the YouTube channel is all yours.
Thanks very much, Peter.
Yep.
I'm a big fan of the library and everything it does, so really excited to be here. And we've been sort of wanting to do this for a while, and I thought we'd do it a little bit later, but I'm glad we're doing it now. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
So I want to say that I purposely ran the risk of overloading this very short talk. It should be about a half an hour if I keep up the pace. So the talk itself is basically a series of documents that became very important to me over the last 5 years. And the subject is more or less the activities of writing and of speaking, and how to speak in our current political and cultural situation. But the excess of this talk is intentional, because it is exactly the excess of these examples that I will discuss that interests me. So they are all about, in some sense, expanded forms of writing and voice, and the forms that speaking and thinking must take to respond to its context. This is a highly personal selection in the sense that it charts texts that affected me at certain moments in my practice. The list itself is pretty strange. So when Peter said that that the library talks include things you wanted to add to the library, and now we would do this online, I thought I would take the opportunity to kind of include texts that are just too minor to really be a kind of part of a library collection in a certain way, that are either articles that were written for a very specific moment, or small things that appeared somewhat ephemerally, or where otherwise pieces of music or videos or things that didn't take this kind of material form of a book or something. So the list is very strange, but instead of weaving together a kind of grand argument out of these really disparate things and sources, I thought I would take you through them, and then hopefully you can see how they relate. So the easiest place to start is a research project I did that Peter mentioned has become a book, or will become a book. Then it was about an event that occurred in 1996 in a casino outside Las Vegas, where the French philosopher Jean Baudrillard gave a lecture while wearing a gold lame coat, like a kind of Elvis or Liberace style golden coat with kind of diamond-studded collar. So the first document I want to present is an obituary written for Baudrillard after his death in 2007 by the writer Chris Kraus, who was the one who organized that event. So she was the one who invited Baudrillard to give the talk. And of course, you will know Kraus from books like I Love Dick or Aliens and Anorexia, her most recent Social Practices. But she wrote this in 2007 after Baudrillard died. And this is from the Semiotext website. Semiotext is the press that she runs in Los Angeles. Let's see here. Here it is. Okay, so I'm just going to read the first little section. At the Chan's event at Whiskey Pete's Casino in Prim, Nevada, November 1996, 400 people lay on the floor at 2 a.m. to hear Jean Baudrillard deliver a lecture on the demise of the real. Because of the drugs, the lateness of hour, Jean's heavy French accent, the bad last-minute translation, and the fact that few of us were trained as philosophers, the people assembled at best heard every fifth word. The response was ecstatic. Jean was wearing a gold lame Liberace suit, and though he was a reluctant guru, he was willing to accept what the audience gave him, a pure, undiluted, unconditional love. Think Johnny Cash performing at Folsom Prison. We were the prisoners of our highly evolved sense of irony. So this passage interested me deeply because, you'll notice that although no one can understand what Baudrillard says, there is nonetheless an immediate and powerful reaction. So in a later essay delivered in 2010, also about this event, Krauss would claim that in organizing the chance event, that was the name of the event, the chance event, her goal was to, quote, make theory go ambient, unquote, or to make theory through practice, to do the work of theory in an atmosphere or event. So the first thing I learned from the event was how theory might be expressed in the form of its unfolding, how theory, which is so often responding to the world around it, then reflects back into the world. You know, usually we think of the way theory enters the world as a book, right? You know, there's the development of industrial production and free markets in Europe, and then Karl Marx writes Das Kapital, and then the Bolshevik Revolution happens, right? So you have this kind of, the world does something, there's a change in the world, the philosopher or theorist reflects that change, writes about it, and then that writing is then reflected back into the world. But, you know, I think every moment of theory is also a historical moment, something that Marx, as a historical materialist, of course, understood quite well. And so our forms of communication and media are also historically specific. And it could be that through other forms of media and other forms of being in the world that we might be able to speak to the present. So the figure of the philosopher as celebrity or as lounge singer then, I think, becomes maybe very interesting in relationship to our time. So I'm going to open a Baudrillard video now that was taken from that event that shows him performing this role, basically. Okay, let's see here. This is a video from the Fales archive in New York, and it shows Jean Baudrillard basically jamming with Mike Kelly and some others, and it's from the Fales archive, and we couldn't really release it in the packet, but there's actually a recording of the performance released by the Mike Kelly studio. So that will be available, and you can hear the audio, which is much better than the audio quality of this, which comes from a VHS camera that was being used on stage. So I'm just going to play a little section of it so you can get the flavor. It gets a little like jammier later on, so I'm going to skip just a second, see what, yeah, it's a little bit more like a jam band later on. So that's maybe Mike Kelly like going crazy on the drums there. All right. So the second thing that I learned from this event was the function of failure. And so, you know, as you can tell from the Chris Kraus passage that I quote, the failure of the event to communicate was a big part of it, right? So it failed to communicate in sort of traditional ways. No one could really understand the lecture, you know, it was very hard to hear. And in this context, I found an essay by N. Catherine Hales very informative. And so that essay is basically called virtual bodies and flickering signifiers. And, you know, in this essay traces what happens basically when language moves from being a physical imprint, you know, that book of Das Kapital that I just mentioned, for example, a physical imprint on a page, to being a series of interlocked codes that produce a digital text on a screen. The fundamental shift is away from presence and absence towards something which seems to, quote, flicker between the two. So a word that is present only because it is code is constantly refreshing. So it's sort of there, but it's always there because the code is actually instantiating it there. So it's actually a kind of process. And what you're seeing is like in the same way that frames create a film, you're seeing what looks like endurance of presence, but is actually kind of a constant refreshing, right? So it's also always possibly absent or changing, even when it is present. So Hale suggests that we are dealing with pattern and noise rather than absence and presence. And in the case of Baudrillard's talk, you know, what would be considered pattern or information, that is the text of the talk itself, became subsumed in the noise around it, which Krauss lists as the drugs, the lateness of the hour, Jean's heavy French accent, and the bad last-minute translation, all like noises that corrupt the, quote, information of the text. However, what I would argue is that this failure somehow turned itself into a form of information. And, or as Hales put it, as she's summarizing an innovation in information theory, and this is the quote that I've highlighted, that begins where I've highlighted on the page. Identifying information with both pattern and randomness proved to be a powerful paradox, leading to the realization that in some instances, an infusion of noise into a system can cause it to reorganize at a higher level of complexity. So, yeah, I think that what I liked about that was that in a way you could see in this quote by Krauss the way that the failure of the talk somehow reorganized itself into an experiment in how theory communicates. You know, if you get rid of the idea of this straightforward talk that everyone hears, understands, and takes really good notes, and then later puts in their PhD dissertation or something, you get this idea of what about an atmosphere creates meaning aside from just the text or the language of the talk itself. In the space of this really short talk, I can't describe my practice in too much depth, which is fine, but I just wanted to say that I was thinking a lot about these things in the time after I finished my MFA degree in Los Angeles. So I consider my own thesis show to be itself a kind of huge failure in a sense, I mean, by my own standards. And so this idea of failure is leading to a kind of reorganization at another level of complexity has always interested me. So at that time, I also tried to think about, you know, what in my work at that time, which relied a lot on printed text, was not working or was kind of, didn't enter or materialize in the world in a form that worked for me or was working. So I located this failure in some ways in the text itself, in the way it entered into the world, and I started to increasingly think about the embodiment of text. In that regard, I started thinking about different sources that have influenced me. And these both somehow related to my own experiences with speaking and other things that I've done with my voice. I mean, when I was very young, I used to sing a lot in choirs and stuff like that. So I had a little bit of experience with vocal training and that kind of thing. And so on the one hand, I started to think about scores and scripts as like ways to think about the writing and the text-based process on the page in interesting ways. And also about the way that that interacts with a performer, with a performing reader, so to speak. So even the idea of a book as a kind of script, which the reader then performs for themselves in their own head, is one way of thinking about it. But in this regard, I was interested in an example of a play by Sarah Kane called 4.48 Psychosis. And Sarah Kane was a playwright who lived a very brief life, but she had a really fascinating, I mean, she wrote some really amazing plays. But in this one in particular, I thought there was something really kind of interesting and strange about the script itself, which has no characters. So as you can see, there's kind of these lines of, you have these, these lines of text, but there's no speaker, right? There's no one saying, there's no character next to I am sad or I am bored, etc. So, it was a bit strange in that way. And then, of course, there's even some moments in the text when we can scroll down a little bit further, here there's, I just like my genitals. I love that line. So here we go. There's this kind of whole, there's just a string of numbers basically scattered throughout the page. And I thought this was a kind of amazing moment, because is this the space of a page? Is it the space of the interior of a speaker's mind? Is it the space of a stage? Like, what is the distribution of these numbers, which are not necessarily listed linearly? So it's not as if a character is speaking them one after the other. They're distributed in some spatial way that is meant to translate performatively, perhaps, possibly. So I thought that, this was just really fascinating. Sometimes when this play is performed, it uses a single actor who does the whole piece, and other productions have used 3 actors to embody the different voices. So I think that that's, also really interesting that directors and performers have a lot of autonomy in thinking, well, what exactly does this play require? Or is it suggesting, how many voices do I hear in this text? How many bodies separated from voices? It doesn't have to have to be a one voice to one body. It can be multiple bodies across a single voice. So opening this up was also very influential to me. And coming kind of from another direction, from that of the performing voice, I just wanted to briefly play a piece that I first listened to when I was a kid, because my dad was really into avant-garde music and classical music and things like that. So when I was really young, was the first time I heard Joan LaBarbera, and her recording, her album Voice is the original instrument. So I'm going to open one song from YouTube on that album called Circular Song. So Circular Song is, it's basically LaBarbera is singing both when she's inhaling and when she's exhaling. So normally, of course, you take a deep breath and then you sing, you exhale. And in this case, she's sort of vocalizing on the intake and the outtake, if you will, on both ends. Now the thing is, her work is quite varied, and she does a lot of different things. This is just one example that I particularly liked. So I'll play it for you right now, quickly. Okay, you get the idea, yeah? So I'm just going to turn the volume down and talk a little bit while she's exhaling and inhaling. So I like this piece because it helped me think about the voice as something both related to speaking and to breathing. So it's somehow being caught in a circuit between language and the body. LaBarbera's work explores the whole territory between these poles, including technological prosthetics, using tapes or electronic manipulation. There was a piece called Hear What I Feel, where she went into a sensory deprivation chamber or something, like kind of sealed herself off from all senses, and then felt a number of objects blindfolded on stage and then vocalized that. So there was kind of this experimental method to thinking about the body and the voice and translating across these things. Okay. Thank you, Barbara. Yeah, she actually, there was also a piece that was made for her by the composer, composed by the composer Morton Feldman, that is for 3 voices, 2 of which are recorded, and the third of which was La Barbara. And so she played in a kind of circuit with these recordings.
Becket,
Mhm.
sorry,
Yeah.
it was very low in volume, but everybody can. The link of the file is in the package, so you can always listen
Yes.
to it later.
Yeah. I mean, if you heard more or less, if you heard it at all, you get the idea. She was vocalizing on both ends of breathing. So it's but yeah, to be enjoyed in the privacy of your home, etc. So take a look at that. In recent works, I've tried to think about the importance of embodiment, um, whether through the position of the speaker or through the function of the voice, and its relationship to thinking. So one essay that really influenced me in this regard was by the playwright Heinrich von Kleist, called "On the Gradual Construction of Thoughts During Speech." Um, and I actually based a whole work on thinking about this piece. There we go. Um, and this is a section in the middle of it. But I based a whole work on thinking about this piece, actually. So Kleist was a 19th century German writer and playwright. And in this text, he talks about how thought is always in excess of the kind of linguistic form that it takes when it's being thought in your head. We think about thinking as sort of talking to ourselves in our head or something. It's a kind of um, mental language or mental activity embodied in language, you could say, perhaps. Um, However, what Kleist kind of argues is that you know is that we think not because we have language, but because of our presence in the world. So, in a sense, something in the world provokes us to think, and then that thought must not only be spoken, but it must always be performed. So, the context in which our thought then becomes speech influences the content of the thought, in other words. So, he gives a number of examples. And in this passage, I like this one because it's more explicitly political. There are other examples where he says, when I talked to my sister, Clyde's sister was a big interlocutor of his intellectually, and they spoke quite a bit. And so he says that's the most stimulating way for me to think, is in speaking with this other person. If I have a problem I need to solve or some puzzle I'm trying to work out. But he talks in this case about a moment during the French Revolution when there was a moment when this person named Mirabeau basically defied the king, the representative of the king, and he did so not necessarily knowing in the narrative that Kleist writes. In this narrative, he does so at first, not necessarily knowing the full gravity of what he's going to do, but it's somehow the context or situation which supplies the real political content that this is in fact a political revolution. To the speaker. So it wasn't like he walked in one day and was like, we're going to have a revolution, screw the king. He has this kind of moment when the gravity of the situation, of the expectations of those around him, somehow coalesce or culminate in a kind of into the full meaning of his statement, which is in fact the inauguration of the revolution. So, as you can tell from my summary of Kleist's narrative, this situation is highly theatrical. And for Kleist, and for the 19th century in general, the theater and the actor on stage was a kind of dominant metaphor for politics. In my own work, I have tried to think about the forms of enunciation and speaking that might be specifically relevant to our time. So, if it's not theater, then what other forms of media, communication, etc., are we interested in that politics takes on as its model? So, yeah, in that regard, one of the artworks that interests me is a video work by the artist Sharon Hayes. So let's bring that up. I really like this video. I first saw it in graduate school when Hayes gave a talk and played this, which is a very early video. It's one she did while she was a graduate student, actually. And this work is called Screed number 13. And Hayes, who's pictured, the artist, has memorized the text of a recording made by the heiress Patty Hearst. So Patty Hearst was daughter of the very famous and wealthy Hearst family, who ran a publishing empire in the United States. And she was kidnapped by a left-wing terrorist group called the Symbionese Liberation Army in 1974 in California. So I'm going to play you a little piece of this here now.
Becket?
Yeah.
There's something with the volume.
Oh, is it really low?
Yeah, I don't think we can hear anything.
Let's
Did you
try.
click the share audio thing? Yeah.
Let's try one more time here. And all right, let's try this.
But they washed them up and they're getting okay. And I caught a cold, but they're giving me pills for it and stuff. I have heard some press reports.
I'm not being starved.
I'm not being starved or beaten or unnecessarily frightened. I have heard some press reports, and so I know that Steve and all the neighbors are okay and that no one was really hurt. And I also know that the SLA members here are very upset about press distortions of what's been happening. They
There's nothing?
have nothing to do with the August 7th movement. They haven't been shooting down helicopters or shooting down innocent people in the streets.
I'm here.
I'm kept blindfolded usually. I'm kept blindfolded usually, and
So that
I can't identify anyone. My hands are often tied, but generally they're not. I'm not gagged or anything, and I'm comfortable. I think you can tell that I'm not really frightened.
terrible.
I'm not really terrified
Or anything.
or anything. I'm not really terrified or anything,
And that I'm okay.
and that I'm okay. I was really upset though. I was very upset though about. I'm sorry.
So here.
I was very upset though to hear about the police storming into that, rushing into that house in Oakland. And I'm really glad I wasn't there. And I would appreciate, and I was really glad I wasn't there.
So that that's just a little piece of the video. So Hearst was kind of forced or convinced or brainwashed to join the Symbionese Liberation Army and took part in a couple robberies afterwards. And so what Hayes does is she reperforms these recordings, which were sent to her parents, her wealthy parents, with lists of demands. And, you know, there's these people sitting off camera who prompt her as she stumbles through this half-memorized speech. So she kind of knows the speech, but she's being, you know, she's being corrected or prompted, and sometimes like looks to the people off camera for assistance. And that kind of blurry line between one's own speech and what is, quote, prompted or given externally, as well as between what is helping versus coercing, are all aspects of speaking that have interested me. This question has a kind of paranoid aspect in being unable to distinguish clearly between friend and enemy or self and other. And this paranoid tone, I think, was captured really well by Guy Debord, not in his 1967 your spectacle, but in this later 1988 work called Comments on the Society of the Spectacle. So I'm going to open that and read from the opening lines, which I think are very interesting. Here we go. Okay. So yeah, as Debord writes, these comments are sure to be welcomed by 50 or 60 people, a large number given the times in which we live and the gravity of the matters under discussion. But then, of course, in some circles, I am considered to be an authority. It must also be borne in mind that a good half of this interested elite will consist of people who devote themselves to maintaining the spectacular system of domination, and the other half of people who persist in doing quite the opposite. Having then to take into account of readers who are both attentive and diversely influential, I obviously cannot speak with complete freedom. Above all, I must take care not to give too much information to just anybody. And then he continues on. Our unfortunate times thus compel me once again to write in a new way. So this image of a kind of single speaker speaking and talking in two different ways at the same time has always reminded me somehow of the sort of Roman god Janus, this two-headed god. I've always loved this image somehow that Debord has. Except in this case, you know, this version, I imagine Janus as kind of standing directly under a large red velvet curtain that sort of separates the room that he's standing in and separates one head from the other, falling just down the shoulders. And on one side of that curtain would be, you know, the enemy, quote unquote, for whom to listen, and the other would be his allies, essentially, you know, the people who are fighting against the spectacle, etc. The revolutionary left, or whatever was remained of it by 1988, who are kind of getting strategic communiques by General Debord. So in a way, I see this as a paradoxical figure and ultimately impossible gesture to separate friends and enemies under the terms of the spectacle, kind of like divide your audience and somehow create a way that one half would hear what you're saying in a totally different way from the other half. And I think somehow the difficulty or paradox of that, of trying to speak to a kind of truth external to a spectacle from within the spectacle, in Debord's terms, was very interesting, problematic. So I wanted to just finish this talk by discussing two texts, each of which I feel demonstrates something interesting about speaking in our contemporary culture. Both attempt some form of explanation of the current situation, but are also symptoms of it and products of it. And often with texts or artworks, especially theory, we kind of speak through them, inhabiting their voice, like a kind of ventriloquist or puppeteer, to talk about social or political questions. You know, I use Marx or I use Debord to talk about neoliberal spectacle or something. Now, with historical distance, these can also be spoken of as products of their time, the ways that Debord reflects these attitudes of May 68 or whatever. Now, in the following, I kind of want to do both, seeing each as a commentary on and as an example of a kind of current political, cultural situation. And perhaps in this way, we are partly fulfilling Debord's injunction to speak from two mouths, as there is a from which we might only address allies. That is not to say there is no line between friends and foes, but it just means that the position of speaking that we might inhabit is not so linear as even Debord suggests. So to demonstrate this, I wanted to discuss two texts. The first is an essay by the writer Bret Easton Ellis about the actor Charlie Sheen. Let's bring that one up. There we go. Bret Easton Ellis, Notes on Charlie Sheen and the End of Empire. So Ellis is a writer, and he himself is a kind of toxic troll who is famous for his novel about the psychopathological trolls of neoliberal capitalism, called American Psycho. And this text, which was first written in 2011 and very interestingly edited since then, I think, focuses on the breakdown of Charlie Sheen in 2011. But Sheen is just one example and hardly the most important compared to, I think, other examples of celebrity breakdowns that we can talk about and have been talked about, like Britney Spears, very famously, Kanye West, Lindsay Lohan. To me, these are more like paradigmatic or maybe more important events culturally than necessarily this one about Charlie Sheen. Celebrities have always had breakdowns in the public eye, but the distinction that Ellis makes between empire and post-empire aesthetics is what interests me. And Sheen's particular kind of let it all hang out attitude is also perhaps presages the post-empire Trump presidency. So I think, Ellis was kind of, through his own sort of admiration, sort of grudging admiration for these sort of toxic male figures, I think also was able to see in Sheen something that was happening at a larger cultural level, which maybe Trump brought to a kind of macro political level. Let's put it that way. So the empire to which Ellis refers can be read in many ways. It is an imperial culture industry, a regime of representation that in its imperial phase insisted on the separation of the image from its production, including the personal lives of its biggest stars. And it ultimately believes in its own imagery. So when Ellis writes about empire, he's writing basically about a kind of culture industry, Hollywood, etc., that is invested in its figures and tries to hide all the mechanisms of that illusion. In some ways, his own this concept has been mapped onto modernism and postmodernism, and he wrote a script for a film directed by Paul Schrader called The Canyons, that also kind of tried to enact this post-empire theory of celebrity, and they cast Lindsay Lohan, of course. There's a sort of a sense in which there's a little bit of like the postmodern revealing of the machinery or mechanism of the production of the image, and that kind of self-critical gesture. But I think it's actually a bit more, it's ambiguous. He doesn't really define the concept in this essay at all. He simply goes through different celebrity controversies and then just says, that's empire, that's post-empire. So he kind of does this thing where he says, Michael Jackson, that is so empire. And in many ways, like the sort of after Jackson's death, the documentary that came out and then some of the subsequent discussion of his life has been kind of the post-empire reaction, maybe, to his empire style reaction, which was to kind of deny humorlessly everything and kind of, present himself in a particular way. And to be kind of invested in the earnestness as well as the kind of the goodness of the image that he tried to project. Whereas with Sheen, obviously, as with Trump, there's a kind of like, I'm debased, I'm degraded, whatever. There's this kind of big capital W, whatever quality to it. So I think the post-empire is a bit like this conspiracy that everyone knows about, if you will, that has kind of been openly acknowledged. And how to speak against such a post-empire is a difficult question. And that's maybe where the Du Bois text and some of these other texts I've been talking about tie into this one. So, for example, I'm very interested in Fiona Apple's 1997 Grammy Award speech, which I think tends to fall quite flat as a sort of speech to speak truth to power, if you will, and it kind of demonstrates the difficulty of critique when those gestures are simply consumed and repackaged as material for celebrity news. More recently, these award ceremonies, we are used to like more of a hybrid of contrived and semi-spontaneous gestures. Obviously, Kanye West is like a very good example of both of those qualities. And so the question of how to speak arises again. Now, the second text I want to discuss was written by a man named Christopher Dorner, who was a police officer in Los Angeles, and then before that was in the United States Navy. So this, how should you go to the top of the text? Graphic and disturbing. Okay, here we go. So Dorner, in 2013, responding to his own personal experience of corruption in the Los Angeles Police Department and to this long history of racist abuse by the LAPD, he began a campaign to kill and terrorize members of the police in Southern California. His actions are not really what I'm going to talk about or interest me here, but it's actually this manifesto he wrote, which outlined his case against the police, but also included a long list of shout-outs to celebrities, commentary on television shows, and personal advice to politicians that seemed out of place in the history of political manifestos. So it is at the same time all these different things in one. It is a suicide note of a depressed and hopeless person. It is a political manifesto about power and abuse, and it's a kind of fan letter. So, for example, between one paragraph where he's thanking all of his past lovers and a paragraph after it where he's encouraging a national ban on the ownership of assault rifles, Dorner writes, "It's kind of sad I won't be around to view and enjoy The Hangover 3. What an awesome trilogy. Todd Phillips, don't make any more hangovers after the third. Takes away the originality of its foundation. World War Z looks good, and The Walking Dead Season 3, second half, looked intriguing. Damn, gonna miss Shark Week." So, this is a strange way to talk about one's own death. And, obviously he's anticipating being executed by the Los Angeles police. I mean, he knows that if you go around shooting cops, you don't get a trial. Like, that doesn't happen, you are not captured alive usually in these situations. So it's a really, it's a very strange way to talk about that situation. But I think somehow the way that it relates to celebrities as if they are personal friends, and to politicians as if they are celebrities, which also means talking to them as if they are personal friends, and to a history of power and abuse by the Los Angeles police as a kind of personal grievance. These are all very much part of the inseparability within the spectacle or post-empire or whatever you want to call it of these different spheres. And just so we don't make the mistake of thinking that this manifesto might hope to pierce this post-empire system from a theoretical outside, and it, as if it can't then be itself incorporated back into this stream, then we also have a video from Charlie Sheen, whom Dorner also addressed in this manifesto in somewhat friendly terms. And Sheen here is responding to Dorner on TMZ. So I'll play this for you now. Wait. Sorry, forgot the sound again. Here we go. There we go. This should work. Okay.
Let's figure out together how to end this thing. Call me. I look forward to talking to you.
One more time.
Christopher Dorner, this is Charlie Sheen. You mentioned me in your manifesto, so thank you for your kind words. I'm urging you to call me. Let's figure out together how to end this thing. Call me. I look forward to talking to you.
So, I hope everyone could hear that. Let's see. So obviously this manifesto kind of entered back into this stream of which TMZ is a really important and particularly critical aspect, and really came along to create contemporary celebrity culture at that time. But my interest in the manifesto is not really in a kind of traditional critique of the post-empire. But what I find interesting is the way it acts like a net that picks up everything around it. So you can think of it as a kind of grid, not really as a specific line of thought about a political situation, as most manifestos are or try to be, but instead it allows itself to contain all these aspects of fandom, politics, celebrity, and historical trauma, and speak in multiple voices and positions. So it, acts as a complaint, it acts as a fan letter, it acts as a political manifesto, as a personal cri de coeur. And this method in some ways speaks back to the post-empire in its own form. So if the result seems deranged, I think that is partly to do with the cultural situation that is responding to, with the deranged conditions of speaking that it encounters. So it's with this example and some others that I've talked about, that I think thinking about what forms of writing, of speaking, of thinking, and of voice become relevant, basically, for talking to this situation. And with that, I will end my talk. So thanks very much.
Thank you, Becket.
Yeah.
Thank you for a great, weird selection of nice things. I do want to say that I posted this link to all the documents again in the comment section. It's the first comment, but it's also somewhere halfway.
Mm-hmm.
Because some things were maybe not so easy to hear. I'm also curious if anyone. Do you see the comments, Becket?
Yeah, I can see them now. I just switched over.
Curious if anyone has any questions, please comment. Last Sunday you did an online or an Instagram live from Gotthard. Is there another one coming up?
I hope so. I'd like to do another one. I mean, it wasn't one of these examples of an event that was canceled that we decided to do online instead. We had no Goth Talks planned, but then somehow I thought it would be a good thing to do somehow with everyone at home, and it seemed like a good moment to try out doing things on Instagram Live. And yeah, depending on how people feel and what the vibe is and how people are feeling about it, maybe another one in a few weeks would be a good idea, as we'll probably be in the situation for a while. But I'm also very conscious of people feeling just burnt out and kind of needing to deal with this situation, this pandemic situation, in other ways, and also in tuning out and not engaging with things. So I don't know. We'll see how it feels, how I feel. But yeah, I'd like to do another one.
Yes. I don't think there's any questions.
I see a lot of desire to discuss Kanye in particular.
Yes.
So, which I would defer to others, because I feel like other people have much more experience in Kanyeology. Some people don't like me talking about Kanye, but I was going to say I'm not. I don't have any advanced theories. I do think that Kanye's more recent things with Trump are an attempt on his part to kind of flow into this post-empire kind of spectacle and try and recalibrate the ways that identity is formulated on being, and the way people formulate their identity based on these kind of political identifications and sloganeering. So And I don't have any. I think there are other people who could talk about that much more interestingly. But I think he's trying to do something very interesting. I don't agree with what he's doing, and I don't think it's maybe working the way he wants it to. But I think he in particular has a really sophisticated understanding of how these kind of mechanism works, and I think that goes back, a long time, back to tracks like Pinocchio's story and things like that, where he's really talking about his own self-representation. So it's not a recent thing. He's been thinking about it for a long time. That's all I got on Kanye.
There's something that I really told myself not to ask you about, but people want to hear more about the Chance Event book.
That book.
It's been in the air for some time now.
Yeah, I started that research a long time ago, around 2014 or something like that. So it's been 5 or 6 years now. And it's something I started basically when I was in LA, and I was I was talking to Chris Kraus about it, and did a number of interviews, and she gave me a lot of material about it, and so slowly it kind of built into this larger research project. And I started with Chris and with her archive and her thoughts and what she had, and then went to New York to the Fales archive, which has the archives of both her publishing house, Semiotext, as well as her personal archives now. And then that's where I got the video from, and that's where I got the text of the Baudrillard talk that no one could understand. And that was a super weird moment to look at the text of this talk, which was given, but that no one understood. So in this way, felt like I was sort of the first person to ever read it. It had been delivered, but somehow so completely missed that this was like essentially an unpublished piece of text. And then we're also publishing that in the book. And we're publishing that as a kind of facsimile of the manuscript, because we wanted the materiality of the text to still be represented somehow. Even if it couldn't be performed or voiced by Baudrillard in a gold jacket, we could still kind of acknowledge the messiness of its delivery by showing this copy that had been translated by Silver Lautringe, also part of, founder of Semiotext, and then hand corrected by Baudrillard. And so it has all these kind of scribbles all over it, and it's got like facts back and forth between LA and Paris all over it, like several times. So it's kind of a cool document. And then we got the poet Louise Baus from Mexico City, who was at the event and performed at it, to write a kind of gonzo journalism style first person account of his time there. And that's an amazing, amazing text. Reads like a freight train. It's like totally crazy. And Chris wrote an expansion of her essay that she wrote about the Chance event, and the Baudrillard text. And then I have a series of texts in the book as well, talking about it based on interviews I did with people who participated. Other artists who were there, participants, writers, that kind of thing. So that's the book, and I have no idea when it's coming out, because we were like just about to get on like publishing it, and the book's all done, it's all written, it's all designed, it's all laid out. The only thing is now we have to, we're still sort of working out the exact distribution question, and obviously with this situation, we're going to kind of let that go, for a while, assuming everyone's kind of getting their stuff together, their schedules together. So I couldn't tell you when it'll be out, but someday it exists.
Nice.
Cool.
Okay. Thank you so much.
My pleasure.
Thanks everybody for tuning in. And I think the talk will be available on this YouTube channel after the talk as well as you have 7 days to download the documents on WeTransfer. I don't think it's with, the question is, are you publishing with Semiotext? But it's another publishing.
Yeah, it's with Athénée Press, which is a great press run out of Bogota, but also from Mexico City at a certain point. and that publishing house does very slow projects, very kind of intensive, usually with artists writing about other artworks or events that they are interested in. So it's not really their research that they do to make their own artwork necessarily. Like if I did research on Heinrich von Kleist and that essay, I wouldn't write about that, but I would write instead about another artwork that somehow influenced me or influenced the way I thought about performance. For example, this event with Chris Kraus and Baudrillard. So that's how, that's kind of the idea of the press. So it's a great press. Yeah.
Yes. Okay.
All
Just
right.
over an hour. Great.
Cool. Thanks very
Thank you
much,
so
everyone.
much.
Thanks, Peter.
Thank you, everybody. Bye.
Bye.